We really put specialization on Hamilton at the last one, and we'd like to maybe do some things on the second chat with maybe Decker's Corners and Horns Corners and the Cedar Creek area, so watch again for that. There's coffee and cookies, which some of you have found, and later on I will be passing the hat to help defray the expenses that the Culture Center has for the chats. And also, my good friend, former Cedarburg Alderman, Art Filter, has some cards that if any of you have questions that you would like to ask of the panelists. I know there's many of you here who possibly have some connection with the Fox Farms, so if you have questions, or we also want to involve the audience. If you have something that you want to say, please feel free. Just get my attention, or I might even come and ask some of you to make some comments. It's my pleasure then to introduce our panelists for today. And our panelists for today, if you saw the brochure, one of the people who was supposed to be here, who many of you know, Loyal Wells, Loyal had 5 bypasses about 2 weeks ago, so Loyal could not be here today. From what I gather from his daughter, speaking to her the other day, he's doing okay. And the other panelists, first of all, Art Filter Sr. Art Filter spent a number of years working for Herb Neiman on the Herb Neiman farm, and there's a lot of mementos over here that the panelists have bought, and a couple of things that Art brought along, the shovels that they used to dig the post with, and a few other things, and the hog rings. And so if you haven't noticed those things, please take some time later to do that. Roger Ron, who chastised me for putting his nickname in the paper, so I won't mention that. And Roger, again, like many other Cedarburg people in his younger years, worked on the Fox Farm. And Janet Bevrons, whose dad was, now Janet Bevron, whose dad was the general manager of Fromm Brothers and Neiman's, and Janet grew up close to the Fox Farms. Clarence Shorty Grossi, and Clarence worked for Herb Neiman, and then also spent some time in some of the other farms, and he'll have some interesting things to say as well. Dr. Howard Krieger, who spent, again, like many people did, his younger years working on the Fox Farms, and now a retired veterinarian living in Evansville, Wisconsin. And then Dr. Gordon Stevenson. Gordon's dad, Ron, was the proprietor of the Stevenson Farm, which now many of you know where Cedar Point is located. And Ron has some interesting things to tell us, some words of wisdom, I believe, Gordon, that your dad shared with you. So with that, and there's one other person here who I want to introduce, who it's just fabulous that he's here. Gary Mason and his wife, Sue. You want to stand, Gary? Gary and his wife are now the owners of the former Hamburg ranch or whatever it was called. Yes. And they brought along the box, and they brought some pictures, and they now are in the process of setting up tours of the old Hamburg facility. So there are some brochures there, and we'll have Gary share some things with us later on what what's going on at Hamburg and what's there. So we really thank them for coming down from Wausau, or the Wausau area, to be here today. Thanks a lot, Gary and Sue. Okay, with that, Art, I guess we can start off with you with some memories, or as we say, some stories about the what it was like on the Fox Farm. Okay. So we'll start with you, Art.
Okay, I was about 18 years old when I went over to the Fox Farm, and they gave me a shovel and a pick and post-hole digger, and they said, get busy and work. And we did a lot of digging with trenches, for putting the wire in the ground. They had to put that in the ground so the foxes wouldn't dig out. And the yards were 40 by 40. So you dug those trenches. They're about 30 inches deep. They went up to your hip, and it's just wide enough so you could stand in it to get down to the bottom. It had a spade, or you had a shovel. I got a shovel there. That's a new shovel. It comes from Ames, Iowa. It's made that you can put your foot on the back of the shovel and for digging post holes. Today's shovels you can shovel gravel, but you can't dig no post holes, you know. See? So that went down straight. So you got so much a trench, but it never amounted to more than 30 cents an hour, you know, if you got a little. You dug about 3 trenches a day. If you had good digging, if you were lucky, you got 4, so then you made a little extra, you know, see. But there was a lot of people that were working there doing them. And then after the trenches were dug, then they came to post holes. Now this is the time when there was no mechanical equipment. It was all shovels and picks. All them yards, and there was like thousands of acres of yards with posts. That was all put in by hand. A lot of people worked there. They had a lot of people working there on the Fox farm, which gave them a lot of work. And after the post holes were put up, then the wire came. They put the wire around, you know. And there was you had a shelf wire on top so the foxes couldn't get up. They hit that shelf wire, and then you had 2 rows of wire on the side. And they had to be all hog ringed. I got the hog ring pliers there with the hog rings. And boy, I tell you, you dug that all day. It finally got the big blister, and you had to bite your teeth every time you put that pliers together. And then the bottom, that was all hog ring too. So that was the part of the building, you know, the Fox farms. And the roads were about 12 foot wide, and then they had 5-foot spaces between each yard, you know, to keep them apart. And the foxes, they would like to dig, and they'd be digging, and every once in a while they'd dig themselves out. If they were digging, you had to go in there and close the holes up or get them out, and sometimes they would be down 5 foot. They'd be in the next yard, but you had to get them out and close that hole up. I know guys held you by your feet, and you'd put a long stick in that foxhole, you know, because they'd go about 8 or 10 feet, maybe 15 feet, and then foxes would make a little spot just about where they were, you know, and you could find that, you know, and you get them out of there and close the holes up again, you know, see, so, and then after a while, we had a lot of people, young boys from high school come in, and in the summertime, then we started feeding the foxes, and we've had the dishes like we got over there, and they had to be washed. So there were probably a couple of thousand dishes that had to be washed, and they had to be sterilized, mind you, sterilized, the fox dishes. They were very fussy. And the feeders, which I was after a while, if you found a little meat in there, old meat, you put that dish on the side, and if you had maybe 5 or 10, you went back by the dishwashers and you told them, listen, you better do a better job. These dishes are dirty. So, and we fed a lot of fox meat, and you took care of about 250 yards. Then when you were a feeder, that was your job, and I worked there about 8 years. And you seen to it that they got fed and watered and made it and all this stuff. It was pretty nice work. And I see Herb Neiman is on there with the pelts, and he took us up there and grading pelts. So I know how that worked. The pelts, they were like a big gym, like we in Cedarburg, you know, the old gym, you know, and the fox pelts were all hanging up there on a rack, you know, and we slept underneath the tails, you know, where they had, and then they brought them out, and then they had to be, they put on a nice blue light. You had to shake the pelts and get the fur up there, and then they got put on piles, you know, the better ones, and then the second one, and then the ones that weren't so good, and then they got shipped. This was up at Hermansville, and in the spring of the year, I went up there too with 2 other guys, and we had to catch those foxes and tattoo them. All foxes had tattoos in their ears. And the left ear, you probably got, like ours at Herb Neiman's, that was S Ranch. So you put the S, you had a little wooden spoon with the tattoo needle or a thing, you know, and it was on 2 dry cell batteries and some ink. And you put that in there. And then on the right ear, you put the yard. The yard had a number. And then if it was like 100, you put 100, and then with the pup, for the new pup, that was 101. And then number 102, that got in. So if a fox got out, you knew just exactly where he should go. And also on the records, they kept very good records. They put in how much they got for that fox pelt in New York. And in like 38 or so like that, there were prices of over $200 for the pelt that they got, see? So those were the kind of foxes that you wanted to keep and with the good quality and mate them foxes together. The same way with if the pair had only 3 young ones, they would get shipped out. You wanted to have an average of 4 or over. And maybe there was a good male, you kept the male then, see? But Herb Neiman, he wanted an average of 4, and if you made that, well, he was happy, see, so.
Now, Art, you said Hermansville, that's where Herb Neiman went. And then the Fromm brothers were at Hamburg, right, Gary? Yeah, okay. Just so we know the distinction between them.
Hermansville, that's up in Michigan, and those boxes there, there was 3 foxes going each side, and that cover slid, back and forward, and that was 6 foxes in a box. In a truck load that went up to Hermansville, at least from Ed Neiman's, there were 144 boxes on that semi. So that's like, I might be wrong, but 864 foxes, I'm thinking that's probably pretty close, see? And they were all, we had to load them up there, and then Clarence Caston, he used to drive, but he isn't here, he had company, but he drove one truck and drove that up to Hermansville. I don't know what road I would ask him what road he took, but that was a big place up there, and then they unloaded them, and the next day they come down again, and then the next day they ship again. They had, a couple of weeks of those trucks going up there, The reason for them to go up there was it was cooler up there. They got shipped like in September, and up in Michigan, upper Michigan, why it was cooler there and they had better fur. And as I said, those boxes were all about 4 inches apart. That's so they wouldn't rub, you'd ruin the skin, see? And all the boxes, they had a lat over the top so they wouldn't move. And then, that was a pretty high truck. So that's about the story on that a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Art. Mr. Ron.
Well, I thought Art was going to steal my opening story. I can remember the first day starting at the Fox Farm. We were down at the Fromm Brother up on top of the hill where the Mequon Golf Course is now, in the main building, and I was handed a pair of rubber boots. I was handed a rubber apron, and then I was walked into a room that had a great big tank on one side, and that thing was just piled full of dishes. And then they showed me a machine. There was a brush that was basically, the brush was the size of the pan, and the thing was to put the pan on there and get it good and clean and then go around. Well, washing the pans wasn't so bad. It was once in a while grabbing into that big tank, getting a stack of fresh ones to wash, because some of them were pretty ripe. And as Art pointed out earlier, after they were washed, then they were pressurized, steam treated, and to keep them clean. But that's the way we started out, and I'll never forget, we got 35 cents an hour. After that, we were up there in the main building for a while, and after a while, we were sorted out to one of the kind of outlying areas, and at that time, we worked for Mr. Loyal Wells, and Dr. Krieger was one of my partners, and there was Jim Hickman was from Cedarburg here, Willie Volkman was from Cedarburg, Buddy Helm was from Thiensville. These are many names that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And at that, once we got over to the Loyals place, then the Loyals area rather, that's again, it would be the south or northeast corner of the Mequon Golf Course is where that was located. And then we did various things every day watering foxes was just basically like feeding. You had a team of horses pulling a wagon, a special built wagon. It had the large tanks on it, and then you would go to work and take your bucket, fill your bucket, stop at the next hut, or what we call the hut. It was a water hut. It was big enough for 2 pans. You'd snap open the snap, lift up the lid, put it in the water. If it was really pretty cruddy, you'd take it and rinse it out and put fresh water in and go on to the next operation or to the next location that you were watering at. As the years went on, we got involved in a number of other things. Not to get off the subject of foxes, but they did get into turkeys. They started raising some turkeys. The first year was successful. The second year, they increased the amount, but they had a very serious evening right after we took the turkeys off of the wire, put them on the ground. We had a very severe storm, and the turkeys all crowded up against the fence, and we had thousands of dead turkeys the next morning. Some of the other things we got into later on in the later years when we were there, I was there for the 4 summers through high school, and then the Frums went in and started to develop the dog food. A Dr. Roberts was brought in, and of course he was the dietitian that put these foods together, and then we had to feed a lot of that because every pen was marked exactly what batch of food was supposed to be fed to those foxes. So that's about all I have, unless somebody has some questions.
So it was really, it was a well done, well organized, very meticulous thing in terms of the feeding and, and the
Oh, yes.
proper
Yes.
stuff that the foxes would get.
When they would load the wagons for feeding, they were the same basic special wagons for that. They had the platform was quite low, and then they had tubs, big steel tubs of meat. There was food to be fed, and those tubs, if I remember correctly, weighed 250 pounds apiece. Most of the time, you just kind of dragged them and slid them into position, but as you went on, you had to change, put the empty one out and bring the next one forward. They had looked like almost a little coal shovel, but it was a more sturdy material. And that's what you used to dig out of the tub, put it in the pan, and you'd look at the number, how many are in this pen? Okay, well, they get this much. Then you'd go and put that in the feeder box where the pans went in, which was separate from the water pans.
Okay. Janet, do you want to share some of your?
Well, I've got something to say about something Art, I think, forgot. I think he forgot that after they dug these big holes and put the wire in, they filled those holes with rocks. And those rocks today are, I imagine, giving a lot of people that bought those lots, I think they're probably giving them a lot of trouble. Well, my favorite subject is in regard to this food that he's talking about, this horse meat. The main feed was made of horse meat. And these horses were brought in by railroad cars from out west, and they were wild. So the men would drive them up to the corral near the slaughterhouse. And when they'd get up to the corral, my brother and I and our friends would pick out horses that looked pretty good, and we would ride them. And then we'd have races on Saturday, our friends from Cedarburg. And if any of you are here, I'd like to know how you remember that. We'd have races, and the prizes were always penny candy. And we would take those horses and keep them. But anyway, then, of course, they had to be slaughtered. And one of my favorite memories is the slaughterhouse. These horses, if they were wild, would be driven into this big room, and they'd be shot at random, and of course then they'd fall and be butchered. Well, my brother and I would have our maid pack our lunch, and there was a window on the side of the slaughterhouse, so the men built us a platform, and we would stand and look through the window and watch them kill these horses. And of course, nobody could understand how we did it, but it was the only excitement we had. And we were only about 10 years old, so it was okay. But anyway, then of course, one of the horses, I remember they kept it, it had been a racehorse. And the men taught that horse to get down on its knees for me to get on because I was too little to get up on it. And they would crop it behind the knee, and the horse would get down on its knee. But we had a lot of fun doing that. And of course, the slaughtering was the top of our life at that time. But that's where the fox farm and what all the fox food came from were all these wild horses. So I guess that's all about the slaughterhouse.
Roger.
I'd just like to add the fellows that did the slaughtering was kind of a family deal. It was a father,
Sparers.
Melvin Sperber. Then it was followed by a son by the name of, Mike Sperber was the father. Melvin was the son. And then there was a second son by the name of Manfred, who later became fire chief down in Mequon. But it was a family rotation on the fellas that did the butchering there. And then when they were hung up, then a fellow from Cedarburg by the name of George Dowse used to break them down into quarters and halves and so forth, and so they could be handled to be fed into a machine called a hog that was like a super grinder. And George used to feed that, and that's how the meat got into the processing room for feeding to the foxes.
Yeah, Gordon.
I guess in those days, one could feel sanguine about the horse slaughter, right? But nowadays, things have changed so much. And so, because I remember those days to some degree, and I know my kids are abhorred by this, and yet it was our life. And it was our, how we got to go to school, actually.
Well, I think back in those days, it was recognized as a humane way of doing it.
Right.
They were shot. And these fellows that did the butchering, it was one shot to the temple, and down that horse would go, and it never knew it hit him.
You know, I have to confess, Gordon, as you bring that up, thinking in terms of the organizations today, in terms of, being humane toward animals, I thought, we may have some people who come forward and don't recognize the history of, how things were done, and not just the using the horses and bringing them in and using them for the feed, but also the idea of, killing the foxes and using the fur. That there's a lot of people today who wouldn't maybe work today like it did in those days.
Right. It's especially difficult because the fox is in the same family as the dog, as the Kennedy. So from a zoological perspective, so they're very similar in a lot of their behaviors. And so nowadays it'd be a lot tougher, but in those days it was business. It was a different way of looking at things.
And it really was inhuman the way they shot at those wild horses, because they shot at them at random. The horses that weren't wild, they would hold and shoot, but the others, they just shoot at it random.
I have to also confess that up until most recently, I really didn't know why Mule Hill was called Mule Hill. But now I know.
I might just elaborate on it just a bit. It's now what is used to be called Mule Hill, what it is today, but is the sledding hill on Highway 57 at the railroad crossing in Mequon. And but years ago, as Janet pointed out, they used to bring these horses and mules, wild horses, old horses, and they all came in by railroad car. They had a constructed chute there that they could simply run down the chute and go out into the field.
That's how that got its name.
Yes, Mule Hill.
Okay, Clarence.
I have a comment on
Or
this.
Howard, okay, go ahead.
I was going to avoid this subject, but as long as Janet brought this up, I had quite a different experience. When I was a very small boy, my father was a blacksmith horseshoer, and he'd go out to Farm Brothers Neiman shoeing horses. And my job was to chase flies, but then I'd wander around. And I wandered into the slaughterhouse, and I was just appalled at what was happening there. So I ran up to my father crying and telling him about this, and well, it's a fact of life. But every time that revolver went off, it was just like I got shot. Well, as I grew up and worked on the fox farm, and I worked there many years and in the meat room and all over, one accepted this. It was a part of life, part of the food chain. And I think people would be appalled at some of the people today with the use of horses, but for this. But you know, that was an important ingredient in the food of the fox, and it was a necessary thing. The other thing, on commenting on what some of the previous people had said, you know, I always marveled at the miles and miles of fences there were on the fox farm. And I'm glad to have met Art Filter, who put those fences in, and he's 88 years old, and he looks pretty darn good to me. But I did start working on the fox farm with Roger, and I think we were about 12 years old. And I too started in the dishwashing room, and I was there about 2 days, and Loyal Wells needed somebody to cut thistles to keep the thistles from entwining in the fur of the fox. So I escaped that dish room fairly quickly, and I stayed on with Loyal, well, through high school and college, working for him summers, holiday vacations, and weekends. And I'm sorry that Loyal isn't here, because he would have insights into fox farming that the rest of us don't have. And but I am indebted to Loyal and to the fox farm, and I think the fox farm had a tremendous economic impact on this area. It certainly had an economic impact on me in that it paid for my education. And I wish a speedy recovery for Loyal.
Howard, was Loyal like the general manager? Well, Janet's dad was the general manager, but did Loyal have a specific area that he was responsible for?
Yeah, the fox farm was, the entire Farm Brothers fox farm was divided up into ranges, and as I recall it, Wells was one of the ranches. We call them ranches. Wells is one of the ranches, and the main ranch, the foreman there was a man by the name of McCulley, and there's Federal Fox Farm, that was, the foreman was a Besh, and then there was a Cedarburg Fox Farm, and Ernie Barentz was a foreman there, so Loyal was a foreman. And then each ranch was further divided up into blocks, and each block had a letter, A block, B block, so on, and that's what Art referred to. When the foxes were tattooed, they were tattooed A101 and a number of that fox, so they were readily identified. And then these blocks. Well, these fences have always been a marvel to me, because these blocks were all